Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another day of distance learning. So today we're going to be focusing on the last law, the last act, which leads directly into the Civil War. It's something that we attempted to compromise to prevent war, but it didn't quite work because obviously we know that we still have a war to cover. This is going to lead directly to conflict, and as we see kind of in this picture on the left over here, a lot of Northerners that were hoping that slavery was on the outs are growing increasingly frustrated with slavery's expansion and slavery kind of holding on due to the efforts of a lot of Southerners and people moving into the West. So, to review, this is where we are in 1854, right? Our country fully formed, all that, but we still have a lot of territory that's not fully organized. It's not states yet. Today we're going to be focusing on Kansas territory right over here and the Nebraska territory right above it. Mostly we're going to talk about Kansas because we focus a little more in there, but it applies to both. So essentially what is happening is these two areas, Kansas and Nebraska, they want to become organized. They want to become states because we don't need to focus on this too much, but Illinois wants to build a railroad that goes all the way to the West Coast. And so that railroad would go through this area. So they want it to be states. That way it's more official. They can have towns there. They can have taxes, stuff like that. Anyway, because of the Missouri Compromise, which we'll remember from a little bit ago, the Missouri Compromise stated that all this land would just be free states, right? Because it's above that 3630 line. Simple, right? But the problem is when these places are getting organized, southern states refuse to let that happen. They say, like, nope, they're just not going to be states. So there needs to be a compromise. That way these places can get organized and the South will still agree. So what happens is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So in 1854, Stephen Douglas, who we hopefully remember from before, from the last couple compromises, Stephen Douglas, he needs this area to get organized, so he proposes that they decide based on popular sovereignty, which we remember from before, I hope. So popular sovereignty, to review, is that idea that people vote on the issue of slavery, right? It's popular because it's what the most people want, right? If you're a person in Kansas, this law says that you are going to get to have a vote, and you can go and turn in a ballot, and you can say, I want Kansas to be a free state, or I want Kansas to be a slave state. And in theory, that's fair. But we'll see, actually, this leads to a lot of conflict and maybe not being super, super fair. So the immediate effects, right when this act is passed, it cancels the Missouri Compromise, right? Because like we said, that line is not being respected. Popular sovereignty is going to decide the issue, right? There's going to be a vote. And because there's a vote, people in surrounding states and all around the country, they start to move to Kansas because they want to influence that vote, right? They think, oh, if I live in Missouri right now, I can go and move my farm to Kansas. And then when there's a vote, a year from now, 2 years from now, whatever, when there's a vote, I get to cast a ballot, which means I can directly influence whether Kansas becomes a slave state or a free state. So a lot of people move there to try to influence this election. So we have to ask ourselves, both anti-slavery and pro-slavery settlers move into Kansas. What do you think is going to happen? I kind of spoiled it a little bit, but there's violence, right? This conflict is reaching a boiling point that it cannot just simply be solved, right? Talking has clearly not worked. So we actually have direct conflict. And really, the way I would think about this is bleeding Kansas, as we call it, is almost like a mini civil war, right? We see directly pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fighting it out in the Kansas territory. These people are killing each other. They have towns which are like, oh, this is a pro-slavery town, this is an anti-slavery town. They even set up two separate governments, and they are in direct conflict, right? We have people like John Brown, who is an anti-slavery advocate that you guys remember from the other day. John Brown, he goes and with his sons and a few other people, he kills 5 pro-slavery people in the Kansas territory, right? In 1856, there's something called the Sack of Lawrence, which is where Lawrence, which was a anti-slavery town, a bunch of pro-slavery people who support slavery, they go and they burn a bunch of houses down, they beat a bunch of people up, and they what's called sack, meaning like destroy Lawrence, this city. So overall, there's just tons of fighting in Kansas right now. Over 200 people are killed. And it's probably a good amount more than that, actually. So this is where things are really escalating. This is, again, like a mini civil war. One of the contributing factors to this is something called border ruffians. So these are people who are pro-slavery that didn't move to Kansas, and they didn't live in Kansas, but they would get in groups and they would travel to Kansas. They would harass a bunch of anti-slavery people. They would burn houses down. They would fight. They would kill people. And the whole goal for them was to intimidate, meaning like to scare people into not voting against slavery. So they were trying to keep slavery running, and they wanted to try to make Kansas into a slave state. So they even, when the vote was held, they even just went to Kansas, showed up, and started voting, even though they didn't live there. So this was another aspect of how this conflict is getting much more serious and directly violent. Even in the Senate, there was violence, right? This is a very famous story where Charles Sumner, who is the leading abolitionist, meaning anti-slavery senator, he gets beat up in Congress, in the Senate, by Preston Brooks, because Preston Brooks is a pro-slavery person. Charles Sumner speaks out against slavery. He even name drops a couple people. And Preston Brooks is so angered by this that he just beats him with a cane, right? Things have escalated to the point that not only regular people are fighting, but in the government, people are beating each other up. It is absolutely nuts. So, guys, this is where we're going to end today, right? The violence has escalated. War is certain. We realize that talking is not going to work. Everything is really ratcheted up to the next level, and it's gone too far. So hopefully this was helpful, guys, and I'll see everybody on the next one.